managing Active Directory and local users and groups. In this nugget, we're going to dive into some really practical Windows management tasks, starting with managing local user accounts using the Active Directory Services Interface technology. Then we'll move on to using ADSI to manage domain accounts. And we're going to talk a little bit about what sort of the Active Directory management strategy is within Windows PowerShell. Then we're going to look at a third-party add-on from Quest Software, which is free, that allows you to manage Active Directory a little bit more effectively than the Active Directory Services interface does. We'll look at a practical example of importing a bunch of user information from a CSV file and using it to create Active Directory user accounts, and then wrap up by talking about where Windows PowerShell and Active Directory management are going in the future. Let's start by looking at local user and group management. So let's open up an instance of Windows PowerShell here. Now, this Active Directory Services Interface technology can seem like a misnomer. Instead of reading it as Active Directory Services Interface, you really should read it as Active Directory Services Interface. See, when you read it that way, it sort of removes the connection to the Active Directory product, because ADSI does work with Active Directory, but that's not the only directory it works with. For example, let's say I want to retrieve the local administrator user account from a remote computer. To do that, I'm going to create a variable to store the user once I get it, and set it equal to, in square brackets, ADSI, and that's not case sensitive, and then in quotation marks, an ADSI query string. Now, there's really two ADSI providers that we're going to look at. The first one is useful for getting not only domain users, but specifically for getting local users, and it's called the WinNT provider, and that is case sensitive. That'll mess you up if you're not really careful about it. Then a colon, 2 forward slashes, that's kind of important too. The name of the computer. Now, you could substitute the NetBIOS name of an Active Directory name if you wanted to use this to retrieve a domain user. That'll work too. And then it's another slash, the name of the object you want, in this case administrator. Optionally, you can put a comma and the class of object. That could be user or group or maybe a printer queue or something like that. You do have the ability to manage things like that through ADSI. The reason to do that is just in case, for some crazy reason, there's a group named administrator, which is possible. This will make sure that I only get the user account back. So when I hit enter, that doesn't immediately execute. It won't execute until I try to do something with it. So let's take that, pipe it to format list, and see all the properties. Now you can see it going out to the network and actually retrieving that information. So there's the description, the built-in account for administrating the computer/domain, its last login date, the name, min password length, the password history length, all that fun sort of stuff. Now, if we pipe this to get member, here's an unfortunate part of where PowerShell kind of falls down a little bit. This ADSI support was not the very first thing they added to Windows PowerShell. So while we see all these properties, what we don't see are any methods. So you might wonder how you go about changing something, like the description. Well, here's how. You would type user.description, or whatever other property you want to change, set it equal to whatever the description is, hit enter. That has changed your local copy of the information. It has not actually gone out and saved the information back to the computer it came from. To do that, we're going to have to run a method that is not displayed by getMember. It's called setInfo. And remember to put those parentheses after the method name. That actually made the change. If we go up and repeat the query for the user, and then once again pipe it to format list star, we should see that the description was changed. Now, the only thing you can't change that way is the password, which is probably one of the things you might really want to do. The way to do that is set password, and just type the new password, hit enter. There's no need to do setInfo after that. That takes effect immediately. It actually goes back to the computer, hashes the password, stores it, so it's all nice and safe and secure and stored properly. So you're noticing that I'm not using any commandlets here, and that's kind of a thing with Windows PowerShell's built-in support for directory management. There aren't any commandlets. We're using a technology that exists in Windows already, and it's the same technology that you may have used if you did Active Directory or local directory management with VBScript or Perl or JScript or even Kickstart. And that's why you typically won't see a lot of this going on at the command line, like I'm doing now. Typing all these commands over and over and over kind of gets a little repetitive. This is the type of thing that you would usually put into a script file, which is actually something we're going to talk about in the very next nugget. So that's an example of how to manage local users. Let's move on to domain users. And I guess the first thing I should emphasize is the fact that the technique I just showed you works fine for domain users too. Here, let me open up Active Directory users and computers so we can actually see our domain. We've got a sales OU here that's currently empty, so let's create a new user account. We're going to call this John Doe, and we'll give him the logon name of John Doe with no spaces, and we'll set a password for him, a nice strong password. Force him to change it at next logon. Okay, and there he is. Now remember, he's in the sales OU, and the name of this domain is nuggetlab.com. So here's how we're going to retrieve him. There's two ways. The first way would be to, again, we're going to create a variable to hold him in. Again, we're going to use ADSI in square brackets, and this time I'm still going to use that WinNT provider. Instead of the computer name, I'm going to specify the NetBIOS domain name, just NuggetLab, and then the username, John Doe, followed by comma user, just to make sure I get a user account back. And if I look at his properties, I see that I actually did get the user. So one of the reasons to use this WinNT provider to get user accounts out of a domain is that, number one, it's backward compatible with inside AD, so you can use this older NT style technology. A benefit is that I only needed to know the user's NetBIOS logon name. I did not need to know where the user was in the domain. Now the Active Directory native way would be very similar. We're still going to use ADSI provider, but this time we're using the LDAP technology. And again, that LDAP is case sensitive. This time I need to provide the fully qualified distinguished name, or FQDN, so that I can get canonical name John Doe from the sales OU of the nuggetlab.com domain. Now we'll pipe that to format list star, and we actually got more information back this time, or at the very least we got different information. And that's because the WinNT provider is working with the backward compatible technology. It's really not seeing Active Directory as Active Directory. It's just looking at it as if it were an old style NT domain. The LDAP provider requires us to know the FQDN of the user, but the trade-off for that is it gets us a lot more information because it's working natively with the Active Directory technology. Now if I take that Active Directory user and pipe it to getMember, you can see that there's a lot of information available, but again, no methods. So you do have to work slightly differently once you're inside the Active Directory native way. For example, we've got this display name property. Here's how I would change that. User.put, and I'm going to put the display name, and I'm going to change his display name to John Doe. Maybe I realized I spelled it a little bit wrong there. And again, that secret setInfo method that's not shown needs to be called. So let's see if that had any effect. We'll go into Active Directory. I'm going to need to refresh the view here. And if I pull him up, I see that his display name was changed. That set password method also works with these, so if you need to set an Active Directory user's password. Again, if this seems kind of like what you might see from a VBScript example or something else, well, that's because it's basically the exact same technology that VBScript would use to manage Active Directory. Windows PowerShell doesn't have anything more advanced or more PowerShell native built into it. This is what we've got to work with. Unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of what PowerShell gives us. This ADSI stuff is too much like having to program. Not being able to use commandlets really reduces your ability to manage batches of users and do things a little bit more simply. It's not the PowerShell model. So I want to direct you to a website. It's called www.quest.com/PowerShell. And this is Quest software. This is a free set of add-ons. You don't even have to register for it, and you're going to want to come down to the PowerShell commands for Active Directory. Just go there, follow whatever is necessary, terms, agreements, and so forth. Get these things downloaded, get them installed right into your computer. Now, if you remember in a previous nugget, I'm going to go back into my Documents folder, look in my profile. I'm already adding that to my Windows PowerShell every single time the shell boots up. So I always have this Active Directory management capability. Now let's look at what commands this particular free snap-in gives us. Get command, and let's restrict the results to only those in quest.activeroles.ad-management. Now the nice thing about this snap-in is that it's always under development. So by the time you download this and install it, you may find even more commandlets for doing things like managing Active Directory permissions or other stuff. But there's some great commands built into here. This is the way I really think you're going to like managing Active Directory. For example, let's just start with a simple one, get QADuser. And by the way, the reason for the Q is, well, it stands for Quest. And so this lets you know that you're using the Quest ADuser functionality. Eventually, when Microsoft comes out with their own, they'll probably just use get ADuser, and that'll keep the two different commands from conflicting with one another by having the same name. So this should just get every single user in my domain. There they are. If we want to see all the properties for all of those, we can pipe to format list star. Plenty of information. So if we get one of those and pipe it to get member, we can see that we've got lots of properties and things to work with. In fact, if we ask for help with get QADuser, see that there's a lot of other parameters we can attach to get specific attributes or to get all available attributes, to force it to use a global catalog server instead of just connecting to a domain controller. All kinds of different stuff we can do there. So lots of capability, nice explanation, some good examples in there too. So let's try this. Here in Active Directory, in this Tech Organizational Unit, I've created a couple of users. George here does not have anything filled in on his Organization tab, while Robert has CBT nuggets filled in for the company. So let's go back to Windows PowerShell, say get QADuser. Now we've already looked at filtering things. There's two ways I can filter this. I could get all the users, pipe them to where object, and just keep the ones where the company attribute equals CBT nuggets. That'll get me the one user I wanted. Here's the problem with that technique. In a large production domain, this is going to get all of your users and then go through them one at a time to look for the ones you specified. That's not very efficient. It's entirely possible that's going to put a noticeable load on your domain controller, or at least a small amount of additional load for potentially a long period of time. It would be a lot better if we could just tell Active Directory to just give us the users we were after. And the get QADuser command lets you do that. Just give it the attribute you're interested in and tell it the value you want. Now the filtering occurs on the domain controller, so we're only pulling over the user that we actually care about. Let's look at how to take that a step further. Let's say we want to grab everybody whose company attribute is CBT nuggets and pipe them to set QADuser, and we're going to set their city property. Now technically in Active Directory's schema, the city property's attribute name is L, stands for locality or locale, and I could just type L. But the commandlet is also smart enough to realize that inside the Active Directory users and computers interface, the text box is labeled city, and so it'll let you use that too because it's a little bit more intuitive than just -L. So let's set this to New York, and it shows me all of the users it changed. So if we go in, we see that George, which did not have a company, did not have his address changed. Robert, which did have the correct company, did have his address changed. So you can do bulk management that way really, really effectively. Let's take a look at some group management now. Let's create a new QAD group, and we're going to give it the name Nuggets, and we're going to give it the SAM account name nuggets. We're going to create it in the organizational unit, nuggetlab.com/tech, and that will create it exactly where we want it. Shouldn't need, oh well, I guess we need to tell it what type of group. What type of group do we want to make it? Let's make it a security group. And let's make the group scope, let's make it a global security group. We'll go back into Active Directory users and computers, hit refresh, and there's our group. With nobody in it right now. No members. We just created the group. Now let's do something kind of fun. Add QAD group member. What group do we want to add to? Well, we want to add to nuggetlab.com/tech/nuggets. That was the name of our group. Who do we want to add? That's the member parameter. Let's execute another command to get the users we want to add. We're going to get QAD user, everybody who's in the company, CBT nuggets. So that should retrieve our one user and add him to that group. If we go back into the group now, we can see that he was correctly added. So it's a great way to do bulk management in Active Directory in a much more PowerShell friendly sense. And remember, all of these things have help. Never be afraid to say help QAD group member, and it'll give you all the parameters and everything else, and even if you ask, some examples of how to use it. So you've got a lot of capability in there to really start managing things in a much more PowerShell native sense. Now for our last task, we're going to really put those commandlets to a practical use. Let me show you a little one-line command that I've come up with. Now I've actually saved this in a file so that it's a little bit easier to break down. This is a single one-line command. You'll notice at the end of each of these lines I've put the backtick character, which, as you'll remember, is PowerShell's escape character. So that's escaping the carriage return, telling PowerShell that although it's a carriage return, it's not the end of the line. And the only reason we're doing that is so that we can kind of lay this more complicated command out and really break it down and look at what it's doing. So the first thing is to import a CSV file called provision1.csv. All right, well, let's see what's in that guy. Let's just have it open with Windows Notepad. And this is a CSV file we've looked at before. You can see that it's got column names like first space name, department, city, last name, logon name, job title, telephone number, country, fax, employee ID, employee status. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 names in here. When Windows PowerShell imports these, that will create 9 objects. Each object will have properties corresponding to these column names. So each of the 9 objects will have a city property, for example, and that property will be populated with the person's city information. So we're going to import all 9 of those objects from the CSV file. For each object that we import, we're going to execute the new QAD user command. We're going to create the new user in the organizational unit nuggetlab.com/tech. The new user's name property is going to consist of the current object's first name property plus a period plus the current object's last name property. The SAM account name attribute will be set to the current object's logon name property. The city attribute will be set to the city property. The title attribute will be set to the job title property. And the department attribute will be set to the department property. So you can see how we're lining up these columns with the actual Active Directory attributes. And it's an important thing I wanted to call out because this first space name column name is not an Active Directory schema attribute name. This is the type of thing a human resources department might give you, and you have to map that to what Active Directory needs to see. Well, that's really what we're doing here. We're importing them and then using the new QAD user commandlet to map the attributes to those column names. So let's hop down into Windows PowerShell and execute createUsers.ps1. And just like that, all 9 users are created. We can verify it by going into Active Directory Users and Computers, refreshing the display, and there they are. By default, these were created disabled, which is sort of a security thing. Obviously, you could change that if you wanted them to be created enabled, but just, as a default to make sure you're not accidentally creating unnecessary security principles, they're created disabled by default. We can obviously enable that account if we want to, once that user's on the job, has their password, and ready to go. So this is a really great example of how PowerShell can make Active Directory management much easier once you've got the right commandlets. We could just as easily have created 500 users in just seconds. And that really goes back to the ultimate mission of Windows PowerShell. If it takes me 30 seconds to a minute to create one user in the GUI, then it takes me 500 times that to create 500 users. It might have taken me as many as 10 minutes to puzzle out this one single command, but once I've done it and saved it into a file like this, it becomes very easy to reuse that. It just takes me seconds to create new users from that point. And that's really the goal of Windows PowerShell, is to automate these real-world tasks in a way that the GUI could simply never accomplish. It may seem disappointing that Windows PowerShell doesn't have more built-in support for managing Active Directory. But let's look at the situation. Version 1 of Windows PowerShell has ADSI, which means you've got at least as good as what VBScript or Kickstart or JScript has always had. And where this eventual Windows PowerShell Active Directory support needs to come from is not in Windows PowerShell. Remember that Windows PowerShell is really just an administrative engine. It's a core for management functionality. It doesn't actually seek to manage individual bits of Windows or anything else. For example, if you want to use Windows PowerShell to manage Exchange, then you have to install the Exchange admin tools. And those had to be specifically written to live on top of Windows PowerShell. If you want to manage System Center Virtual Machine Manager, same thing. You have to install those tools, and they had to be specifically written. Well, it's unfortunate that in the Windows Server 2008 timeframe, the Active Directory team wasn't able to build on top of Windows PowerShell. But the problem is that by the time Windows PowerShell came along, Windows Server 2008 was already well into its development cycle. There simply wasn't time. Well, we do know that for the next version of Windows, the Active Directory team is building commandlets for Windows PowerShell, and that's when you'll really get the Microsoft-supported official PowerShell native way of managing Active Directory using Windows PowerShell, once those commandlets are available. And over time, more and more pieces of Windows, such as DNS and IIS and most other components, will be built in the same way. So right now we're just kind of in this transition phase, and the PowerShell team tried to give us the technology that they could to leverage something that was existing so that we could do Active Directory management tasks. And in the meantime, the folks at Quest Software decided to sort of fill the gap by providing a set of commandlets that do allow for fairly robust Active Directory management capabilities before we actually get those full built-in utilities and tools right from the Active Directory team themselves. So the future is bright. What we have for managing Active Directory in PowerShell now might not seem like it's the full-fledged thing, but that's because we're in that interim phase, and we will get all the support we need. Just hang in there, and in the meantime, we can still do quite a bit. Being able to create a bunch of users from a CSV file using a single command line is not too shabby. In this nugget, we looked at managing users and groups, both in Active Directory and on local computers. We started by focusing on local accounts and looking at how those can be managed using the Active Directory Services interface. We also looked at using that same ADSI technology for domain accounts, but found that it's a little awkward, and really the procedures are sort of a holdover from the VBScript days. A better way were those free add-on commandlets from Quest Software that allows you to manage Active Directory in a much more PowerShell native sense. We used those commandlets to import information from a CSV file and used it to create new user accounts in Active Directory, all with a single command line. And finally, we wrapped up with a quick discussion on where PowerShell and Active Directory management are going in the future. Specifically, the days when the next version of Windows comes along and Active Directory, as well as most other Windows components, are specifically instrumented to be managed from within PowerShell, and we don't have to mess with that ADSI technology. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.